Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Miles, for inviting me. I'm really honored. I want to start off by bringing up a poet I've always admired and make a connection to Martina Espada, who I greatly admire. In Auden's poem, The Shield of Achilles, Hephaestus shows Thetis not what she wants to see forged on the shield for her son. Instead, he shows her scenes of ruin, humiliation, and horror. Wherever there is war and cruelty and injustice and exploitation, whether that is national, institutional, or personal, Martina Espada's poetry doesn't show us what the powerful would like us to see or what we ourselves might sometimes prefer to see. For example, in Espada's The Skull Beneath the Skin of the Mango, a poem about El Salvador from the collection City of Coughing and Dead Radiators, an American reporter, his arms filled with fruit, looks down to discover that his sneaker has kicked against the forehead of a skull, yellow like the flesh of a mango, where massacre has occurred. In the poem titled Bully, referencing a different history of Theodore Roosevelt than many of us might be familiar with or comfortable with, the statue of Theodore Roosevelt in a Boston school's auditorium seems nostalgic for this Spanish-American War. It wants to reach for his saber, meanwhile being surrounded by Spanish-singing children in hallways. All of the faces he ever shoved in eugenic spite and cursed as mongrels, who plot to spray graffiti in parrot brilliant colors across his Victorian mustache and monocle. In its praise of Espada's latest collection, The Republic of Poetry, the Bloomsbury Review states, quote, "As citizens in Martin Espada's new republic, we're all the better for it." But I would add this from a poem in that same collection. In The Soldiers in the Garden, the dying Neruda says to the lieutenant of the soldiers who have come to his home after the coup that has overthrown Allende, "There is only one danger for you here, poetry." At Hampshire College in May 2007, where he gave its commencement address, Martina Espada said the following: "I welcome you to the Republic of Poetry. The Republic of Poetry is a state of mind. It is a place where creativity meets community, where the imagination serves humanity. The Republic of Poetry is a republic of justice, because the practice of justice is the highest form of human expression. This goes beyond the tired idea of poetic justice, because all justice is poetic." Please join me in welcoming Martina Espada.
Buenas noches. Spanish 101. Yes. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you to all the organizers of this festival. Thank you, Miles. Thank you, Denise, for that reading. Thank you all for being here tonight in this freezing place called Florida. Of course, it's all relative. I live in Western Massachusetts. It's like Canada without the health care. I never thought I would have to begin with a poem to warm us up on this frigid evening, but there you go. And so I want to start with a poem that takes us to a place where it is never 35 degrees. That is the island of Puerto Rico. That's where my family is from. That's where my roots are. And in particular, this is a poem about the music of the island, especially the music brought by the slaves from Africa with their religion, which survived every attempt by the Spanish to stamp it out and is now an essential part of Puerto Rican identity and culture. If you go to Puerto Rico, if you go to Viejo San Juan, the old city, you'll find a street there called San Sebastián, which is famous for its music. There's a big festival there, and all year long you can hear this music coming from the bars and the clubs and on the street itself, and much of it music brought originally by the slaves from West Africa with their religion. So for me, San Sebastián, St. Sebastian Street, is a place of miracles, a place where the impossible can happen, even the end of war and the return of the dead. There's a very simple Spanish refrain in this poem, En la calle San Sebastián, on St. Sebastian Street, so I hope you can hear the music and the words, and I hope we warm up a little bit. En la calle San Sebastián, Viejo San Juan, Puerto Rico. Here in a bar on the street of the Saint, in la calle San Sebastián, a dancer in white with a red scarf in la calle San Sebastián calls to the gods who were freed by slaves in la calle San Sebastián. And his bronze face is a lantern of sweat in la calle San Sebastián. And hands smack congas like flies in the field in la calle San Sebastián. And remember the beat of packing crates in la calle San Sebastián from the days when overseers banished the drum in la calle San Sebastián. And trumpets screech like parrots of gold in la calle San Sebastián. Trumpets that herald the end of the war in la calle San Sebastián, as soldiers toss rifles on cobblestone in la calle San Sebastián. And the saint himself snaps an arrow in half in la calle San Sebastián. Then lost grandfathers and fathers appear in la calle San Sebastián, fingers tugging my steel wool beard in la calle San Sebastián, whispering, your beard is gray in la calle San Sebastián, spilling the rum across the table in la calle San Sebastián, till cousins lead them away to bed in la calle San Sebastián. And the dancer in white with a face of bronze in la calle San Sebastián shakes rain from his hair like the god of storms in la calle San Sebastián, and sings for the blood that drums in the chest in la calle San Sebastián, and praises the blood that beats in the hands in la calle San Sebastián, in la calle San Sebastián. Well, I am from the tropical paradise of Brooklyn, New York. I'm from the East New York section of Brooklyn. Last night I was having dinner and I mentioned that in a conversation. The guy sitting at the table next to me said, East New York, who's from East New York? And I grew up there in the Linden Projects, and it was there that I met my first poet. His name is Jack Agüeros. Amazing Puerto Rican poet, and the director of something called the Museo del Barrio. So he used to have every Three Kings Day these incredible parades of real camels and sheep through East Harlem. Jack now has Alzheimer's, and last year we did a benefit for him in East Harlem, and I wrote this poem for him, recalling when I met Jack Agüeros. It's called Blessed Be the Truth Tellers for Jack Agüeros. In the projects of Brooklyn, everyone lied. My mother used to say, if somebody starts a fight, just walk away. Then somebody would smack the back of my head and dance around me in a circle laughing. When I was 12, pus bubbled on my tonsils, and everyone said, after the operation, you can have all the ice cream you want. I bragged about the deal. No longer would I chase the ice cream truck down the street, panting at the bells to catch Johnny, the ice cream man who allegedly sold heroin the color of vanilla from the same window. Then Jack, the truth teller, visited the projects. Jack, who herded real camels and sheep through the snow of East Harlem every Three Kings Day. Jack, who wrote sonnets of the jail cell and the race track and the boxing ring. Jack, who crossed his arms in a hunger strike until the mayor hired more Puerto Ricans. And Jack said, "You gonna get your tonsils out? Ay, bendito cuchifrito Puerto Rico. That's gonna hurt." I was etherized, then woke up on the ward, heaving black water onto white sheets. A man poking through his hospital gown leaned over me and sneered, "You think you got it tough? Look at this," and showed me the cauliflower tumor behind his ear. I heaved up black water again. The ice cream burned. Vanilla was a snowball spiked with bits of glass. My throat was red as a tunnel on fire after the head-on collision of two gasoline trucks. This is how I learned to trust the poets and shepherds of East Harlem. Blessed be the truth tellers, for they shall have all the ice cream they want. So, after years of being away, I went back to East New York. I went back to the projects. And actually went back with a documentary film crew. I'm the subject of a number of unproduced and unfinished documentaries. And you're just going to have to take my word for that. So I don't know if they even had film in the camera, but there we were in the projects, and I started to remember things. This is the poem that came out of it. It's called Return, 245 Workman Avenue, East New York, Brooklyn. 40 years ago, I bled in this hallway. Half-light dimmed the brick like the angel of public housing. That night, I called and listened at every door. In 1966, there was a war on television. Blood leaked on the floor like oil from the engine of me. Blood rushed through a crack in my scalp. Blood foamed in both hands. Blood ruined my shoes. The boy who fired the can off my head in the street pumped what blood he could into his fleeing legs. I banged on every door for help, spreading a plague of bloody fingerprints all the way home to apartment 14F. 40 years later, I stand in the hallway. The dim angel of public housing is too exhausted to welcome me. My hand presses against the door at apartment 14F like an octopus stuck to aquarium glass. Blood drums behind my ears. Listen to every door. There is a war on television. So, incredibly enough, that poem ended up in the New Yorker in the style issue. Right, you know the style issue, the fashion issue. You have the ads for the Gucci handbags, and you see the Gucci handbag out there in the tundra by itself. As if to say, if you were stranded on the tundra, this is all you will need to survive. And there is my poem about getting hit in the head with a can and bleeding all over the place. And I was reminded of a simile from Raymond Chandler. He stood out like a tarantula on a wedding cake. And speaking of vermin, every Puerto Rican poet has to have a cockroach poem. This is mine. When I was growing up in Brooklyn in the 60s, everybody thought we brought the cockroaches with us. Like we're getting on the plane in San Juan with these great big jars of live roaches and shaking them out in the streets of New York, right? Go, my children, you're free. So this is my contribution to the genre. And I know I'm reading this in a place where people will be understanding and sympathetic because Florida has great cockroaches. They really do. I admire the cockroaches of Florida. And this poem is dedicated to them this evening. My cockroach lover. The summer I slept on JC's couch, there were roaches between the bristles of my toothbrush. Roaches pouring from the speakers of the stereo. A light flipped on in the kitchen at night revealed a Republican National Convention of roaches. In Indianapolis, 500 of roaches. One night, I dreamed a giant roach leaned over me, brushing my face with kind antenna and whispering, "I love you." I awoke, slapping myself, and watched the darkness for hours because I realized this was a dream, and so that meant the cockroach did not really love me. I read that poem in Hollywood. Did a reading in Hollywood. And afterwards, a woman came up to me and said, "You know that cockroach poem?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "That's such a sad poem." I said, "Yeah, those human-insect relationships are so difficult, man." Yeah. Everybody stared at him. Parents didn't approve, you know. Well, we're here in a gathering of people who appreciate small and independent presses because they publish 90% of the poetry in this country. And a year ago, we lost a champion of the small and independent press and therefore of poets. His name was Sandy Taylor. Sandy Taylor was the editor and publisher of Curbstone Press, an amazing small press in Willimantic, Connecticut. Sandy was also a magnificent poet. Very few people were aware of this because he devoted his life to other poets and their work. So he died about a year ago, and this is what happened to him next. He was a dear friend of mine, and I wouldn't do this for just anybody. This is a new poem. It's coming out in the Mass Review, and it's called "The Day We Buried You in the Park." And there's an epigraph: "If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles." Walt Whitman. The day we buried you in the park, I couldn't say no. Your wife had a plan revealed on the phone with the hush of conspiracy. There are laws in this city against the interment of human remains in public spaces. This was the poet's park. Your vision floating like the black butterflies of cinders over the house in ruins across the street. You and Juan saw the stone steps flowing down into the circle where the poets would stand and sing one day. You and Juan saw the poets showering the air with words and the trees drinking words like water. You nailed up the sign and spread your arms to greet us at the ceremony. This could not be explained to the clerk who stamps the licenses for the burial of the dead. Juan began to cry when he saw your ashes in the wheelbarrow. I shook him by the shoulder. The neighbor who watches the park from her window was eyeing us. I handed him the shovel. We had to clamp our jaws like mobsters stoically soiling their hands with the grit of a rival thug. Your wife poured a bag of plant food over your ashes in case the neighbor peeked too long through the hedges or the cops rolled their cruiser to a stop, bored after years of shoving drunks into the back seat. We stirred the ashes with our hands till they turned white at the wrist, and what I'd heard was true. There is bone that will not burn, bodies that refuse to become dust, the stubborn shards of a man. Ask any criminal who labors to bury the evidence. We weren't criminals. We dug the hole in the wrong place, ripped out the roots, grunted with every shovel full of rocks. We made the little grave too big, then tossed away the dirt, forgetting that we'd need to fill the hole once we dumped you in it. When I tipped the wheelbarrow, your ashes landed with a puff, drifting in the briefest of clouds over the grass, and Juan dropped to his knees, crying again, giving us away. The neighbor poked her head from the window like a chicken suspicious of the world beyond the coop. An hour after we began, I wore a mask of ash and sweat, black shoes white, like the last man in the village to hear the warning of volcano, or a miner on the first day back at work after the strike is lost, or a believer smeared with his ancestors about to wash in the great river. A woman who recognized my face stopped me as I crossed the street. "Did you just bury something in the park?" she asked. "Why would I do a thing like that?" I said. The day we buried you in the park, I drove home with 3 scoops of your ashes in a coffee can, chock full of nuts, the heavenly coffee, their slogan emblazoned in a cloud across the New York skyline. At your desk, there was bad coffee and good poetry, but no heaven. So I will look for you under my boot soles, walking through the world, soaking up the ghosts wherever I may go. I actually did a reading later that night at the park, and I was standing right on top of him, and I looked at the audience and said, "Sandy, I know you're here someplace." He was a great mentor of mine, and I went to him for advice on everything when I was a young poet. And now I am no longer young. And the young poets come to me for advice. And so I decided I had to write one poem with all the advice they would ever need. This is it. Advice to young poets. Never pretend to be a unicorn by sticking a plunger on your head. That's it. It's a true story. That's a documentary poem that actually happened. One of my students stuck a plunger on her head, couldn't get it off, and had to go to the emergency room. So with the aid of a little Vaseline, it came off. Left a very large round scar. I don't know why I'm talking about plungers on a day like this. This, of course, is a historic day. The day we finally got rid of George W. Bush. Oh, and something else happened too, yes. The inauguration of Barack Obama. And the point was made today, and I want to make it now, that we wouldn't be here, we wouldn't witness this historic moment without the sacrifice of thousands. Thousands of people who were killed, who were beaten, who were jailed, who were fired, harassed, surveilled, on and on and on. And all you have to do is go as far back as the civil rights movement in this country. My father, Frank Espada, was arrested and jailed in Biloxi, Mississippi in December of 1949 for not going to the back of the bus. He was 19 years old and decided at that moment what he wanted to do with the rest of his life, which was to fight against this kind of injustice. And he did, and his side won. Because today that could never happen in Biloxi, Mississippi, or anywhere else. So this next poem is about that, but his name is not mentioned very deliberately, because this is a poem about the anonymous ones, the nameless ones, the ones left out of the history books. It's also a poem against forgetting, a poem against historic oblivion. And of all days to remember, we should remember today. So this poem also alludes to the freedom riders in the South, as well as my father's own story, and it's called Sleeping on the Bus. How we drift in the twilight of bus stations, how we shrink in overcoats as we sit, how we wait for the loudspeaker to tell us when the bus is leaving, how we bang on soda machines for lost silver, how bewildered we are at the vision of our own faces in white-lit bathroom mirrors. How we forget the bus stations of Alabama, Birmingham to Montgomery, how the freedom riders were abandoned to the beckoning mob, how afterward their faces were tender and lopsided as spoiled fruit, fingers searching the mouth for lost teeth, and how the riders, descendants of Africa and Europe, both kept riding, even as the mob with pleading hands wept fiercely for the ancient laws of segregation. How we forget Biloxi, Mississippi, a decade before, when no witnesses spoke to cameras. How a brown man in military uniform was pulled from the bus by police when he sneered at the custom of the back seat. How the magistrate proclaimed a week in jail, went back to bed with a shot of whiskey. How the brown-skinned soldier could not sleep as he listened for the prowling of his jailers, the muttering and card-playing of the hangmen they might become. His name is not in the index. He did not tell his family for years. How he told me, and still I forget. How we doze upright on buses. How the night overtakes us in the babble of headphones. How the singing and clapping of another generation fade like distant radio as we ride, forehead heavy on the window. How we sleep, how we sleep. Right after the election, I was in Rochester, New York, and I took the opportunity to visit the tomb of Frederick Douglass. And this next poem came out of that experience. I actually read it this afternoon at the inaugural Poets event here. Of course, there the limit was 14 lines, so I only read the verbs. Figure I'll read the whole thing now. This is called Litany at the Tomb of Frederick Douglass, Mount Hope Cemetery, Rochester, New York, November 7th, 2008. This is the longitude and latitude of the impossible. This is the epicenter of the unthinkable. This is the crossroads of the unimaginable, the tomb of Frederick Douglass 3 days after the election. This is a world spinning away from the gravity of centuries where the grave of a fugitive slave has become an altar. This is the tomb of a man born as chattel who taught himself to read in secret, scraping the letters in his name with chalk on wood. Now, on the anvil flat stone, a campaign button fills the O in Douglass. The button says, Obama. This is the tomb of a man in chains who left his fingerprints on the slave breaker's throat so the whip would never carve his back again. Now a labor union t-shirt drapes itself across the stone offered up by a nurse, a janitor, a bus driver. A sticker on the sleeve says, I voted today. This is the tomb of a man who rolled his call to arms off the press, peering through spectacles at the abolitionist headline. Now a newspaper spreads above his dates of birth and death. The headline says, "Obama wins." This is the stillness at the heart of the storm that began in the body of the first slave, dragged aboard the first ship to America. Yellow leaves descend in waves, and the newspaper flutters on the tomb, like the sails Douglas saw in the bay, like the eyes of a slave closing to watch himself escape with the tide. Believers in spirits would see the pages trembling on the stone and say, "Look how the slave boy teaches himself to read." I say a prayer, the first in years, that here we bury what we call the impossible, the unthinkable, the unimaginable, now and forever. Amen. And I want to finish with this poem. This is the world that Barack Obama will inherit. Post-Bush, post-9/11, 2 wars, and we have to do everything we can to help him change it. So I will end with this. This is a 9/11 poem. It's got a focus which is unusual. Focus is on the food service workers who were killed that day at the World Trade Center. And this makes sense if you think about it. These were office buildings in Manhattan, and through every office building in Manhattan there passes a shadow army, making those buildings run. Mostly immigrant and mostly undocumented, invisible in life, even more invisible in death. And that's why I wrote the poem. So, the word alabanza means praise in Spanish, and the full title is Alabanza in Praise of Local 100. For the 43 members of hotel employees and restaurant employees, Local 100, working at the Windows on the World restaurant who lost their lives in the attack on the World Trade Center. Alabanza. Praise the cook with a shaven head and a tattoo on his shoulder that said, "Oye." A blue-eyed Puerto Rican with people from Fajardo, the harbor of pirates centuries ago. Praise the lighthouse in Fajardo, candle glimmering white to worship the dark saint of the sea. Alabanza. Praise the cook's yellow pirate's cap, worn in the name of Roberto Clemente, his plane that flamed into the ocean loaded with cans for Nicaragua, for all the mouths chewing the ash of earthquakes. Alabanza. Praise the kitchen radio, dial clicked even before the dial and the oven, so that music and Spanish rose before bread. Praise the bread. Alabanza. Praise Manhattan from 107 flights up, like Atlantis glimpsed through the windows of an ancient aquarium. Praise the great windows where immigrants from the kitchen could squint and almost see their world, hear the chant of nations, Ecuador, Mexico, República Dominicana, Haiti, Yemen, Ghana, Bangladesh. Alabanza. Praise the kitchen in the morning where the gas burned blue on every stove and exhaust fans fired their diminutive propellers. Hands cracked eggs with quick thumbs or sliced open cartons to build an altar of cans. Alabanza, praise the busboy's music, the chime of his dishes and silverware in the tub. Alabanza, praise the dish dog, the dishwasher who worked that morning because another dishwasher could not stop coughing, or because he needed overtime to pile the sacks of rice and beans for a family floating away on some Caribbean island plagued by frogs. Alabanza, praise the waitress who heard the radio in the kitchen and sang to herself about a man gone. Alabanza. After the thunder, wilder than thunder, after the shudder deep in the glass of the great windows, after the radio stopped singing like a tree full of terrified frogs, after night burst the dam of day and flooded the kitchen, for a time the stoves glowed in darkness like the lighthouse in Fajardo, like a cook's soul. Soul, I say. Even if the dead cannot tell us about the bristles of God's beard, because God has no face. Soul, I say, to name the smoke beings flung in constellations across the night sky of this city and cities to come. Alabanza, I say, even if God has no face. Alabanza. When the war began, from Manhattan and Kabul, two constellations of smoke rose and drifted to each other, mingling in icy air, and one said with an Afghan tongue, "Teach me to dance. We have no music here." And the other said with a Spanish tongue, "I will teach you. Music is all we have." Thank you.